Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for our webinar. So there are two of us here today, myself, Alex, and my colleague, Marc. Marc is the head of safety, compliance, and regulatory affairs from our parent company, Fleet Complete. He's an industry expert who has worked in numerous senior transportation management roles for over 25 years, including as an inspector for the Ministry of Transportation. Marc sits on several federal, state, and provincial regulatory bodies and frequently provides commentary on emerging technology, best practices, and regulatory affairs. In addition, Marc is a commercials driver's license holder and can drive various commercial vehicles in North America. So we're really lucky to have Marc here with us today to answer your compliance questions. As you know, you did have the opportunity to ask questions when you submitted your webinar registration. We had a large number of questions come in. We're going to do our absolute best to get through all of them. However, if you notice that we didn't have a chance to answer your question, please feel free to send us an email with your question to marketing@bigroad.com. If we do happen to have a little bit of time left over before the end of the webinar, we are going to open the floor for a final question and answer session, so you'd have a chance to ask any remaining questions that you do have. If we do get to this point, you can type your questions into the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. Also, just so all of you know, I am going to be sending out a follow-up email after this webinar that includes a full recording of today's session. So that means that you can watch it again or share it with other people on your team. So let's get started. Here's what we're going to cover in today's webinar. So as I mentioned, we'll start by answering the questions that came in before the webinar with your registration. And then if we do get through all of those before the hour's up, we're going to open the floor for a question and answer session where you can ask your questions live. So we're going to start with the questions that were asked with your webinar registration form. So I'm going to highlight the question first, and then Marc can answer it. So a question here from SFL Express. When a driver runs out of hours at a shipper or receiver and is being forced to leave the property, how can this legally be done?
Well, thank you very much for that question, SFL Express. Difficult response because there's no easy answer to this. And essentially, as a driver, I would notify your company at the first sign that your hours of service maximums are about to reach its threshold. I would have your company get in contact with the shipper or receiver to make some kind of reasonable arrangements for you to stay there. Now, based on my experience, I know shippers do not like to have trucks sort of linger on their property, but that being said, if they're contributing to you being over on your hours, they should reasonably give you a spot to rest. You could also look at perhaps getting another driver to come over to assist you. You could leave the premises and annotate the situation in your hours of service log, but I want to stress that that would not potentially preclude you from being cited because you have in fact gone over on your hours. If you are completely relieved of responsibility by your motor carrier, you could then perhaps use the personal conveyance rules to get a place of safety. And in the worst case extreme, you could arrange to get a tow truck actually to take you to the closest parking lot. So not an easy answer, but those would be my response to that question.
So SLF Express and Lisa from Landons Transport Service, Inc. asked similar questions, and that is, what type of logs need to be stored?
All right, so there's a few things that we have to cover on this. And to begin with, it's from the driver perspective, what the motor carrier has to do, what a driver has to do when starting work for the first time. If you're operating a vehicle that is a model year 2000 or older, and there's some different categories of supporting documents that are required. So let's start with the driver at roadside. So if asked for records, the driver, of course, needs to surrender the hours of service log for the day in question and the previous 7 days if operating in the United States. If in Canada, the day in question plus the previous 14 days. The driver is also, if operating under ELD, to surrender the user's manual describing how the ELD is managed. There has to be an instruction sheet describing the data transfer mechanism supported by ELD. as well as step-by-step instructions to produce and transfer the driver's hours of service records to the official at roadside. There's a similar situation when I speak on the motor carrier when we get at that point. There's also an instruction sheet for the driver describing if there are any ELD malfunctions, how they should be reporting, how they should be recorded, and also the driver is required to have a supply of blank driver logs and graph grids sufficient to enter the day in question and the previous 8 days. This is critical because if the ELD or AOBRD for that matter does malfunction, it's key to have a backup, and that would be the paper logs. From the motor carrier's perspective, there must be the ELD record of duty status and all backup data. So essentially what the motor carrier is using to conduct business, the business records attributed with that must be readily available. The backup copies of the records must be maintained on a device separate from where the original data is stored. Additionally, a motor carrier must retain a driver's ELD records in a manner that will protect the driver's privacy. Just as a note, the Big Road system stores the driver's logs on our servers. They're separate from the mobile device running on the Big Road mobile app. This is done to satisfy the requirements of both ELD and AOBRD records that are stored. Thirdly, for a driver who's starting work for a new motor carrier, the driver essentially has to rebuild his 7 days previous to starting with the new motor carrier. These records, again, have to be surrendered at roadside to the inspector. If a driver is operating a vehicle that is year 2000 and older, as you know, they're exempt under ELD. Well, there has to be some kind of documentation on the vehicle engine year according to Part 379 of the regulation. It requires the motor carrier to maintain all such documents on the engine changes at the principal place of business. So if your driver is going to use a model year vehicle 2000 and older, there is a process to surrender documentation confirming that fact. If that's not the case, you can reasonably expect your driver will be delayed at roadside while the safety official is trying to confirm whether you're complying or not. Now, there are different categories of supporting documents. There's essentially 5 main categories. There's the bill of lading, itineraries, schedules, or any equivalent documents that indicate the origin and destination of each trip. This also includes dispatch records, trip records, or any equivalent documentation. This would also include expense receipts relating to any on-duty not driving time, electronic mobile communication records reflecting any communications transmitted through the fleet management system, and finally, payroll records, settlement sheets, or any other equivalent documents that will indicate how a driver was paid. As you can reasonably expect, I was a former government auditor and I've been audited a lot of business records, and these types of supporting documents are used to verify the accuracy of a driver's log. So as a motor carrier, you should be doing your due diligence and confirming that all the date and timestamps on these electronic and paper documents do in fact reflect what your drivers are putting down on their hours of service logs. If they do not match, there's a potential for citation for both the driver and the motor carrier, or both.
All right, so next question here. How long do driver logs need to be stored?
Driver logs need to be stored for a period of 6 months. It has to be at the principal place of business. And typically what happens at time of audit is an auditor will select 1 month of logs within the past 6 months. Now again, with Big Road, if you were ever audited, you should contact the Big Road office, and we have a process that will enable us to forward on the applicable 30 days of records that the auditor is asking you to surrender.
Got a question here from Chris from SCO Trucking. He asked, can we edit driver logs?
So in the case of both AOBRD and ELD, there are different scenarios that you want to follow with respect to editing of logs. In both cases, they can be edited, but as you've probably heard with the case of ELD, it's much more rigid, so you certainly cannot edit any drive time. You can edit in order to correct any mistakes on the log. Now for ELD, one area where you can in fact edit drive time is if you're in a co-driver scenario. If the driver does not elect to recertify, that will also be reflected on ELD, because as you've probably heard with the anti-harassment provisions under ELD, the motor carrier can submit and request edits on behalf of the driver, but the driver must in fact certify by either accepting the edits or rejecting the edits. This is different than under AOBRD, when in fact the motor carrier can edit logs on a driver's behalf.
So similarly, George from SGS Express asks, do drivers have to sign logs after they've been edited?
Yes, the driver does have to sign the log, because that is the only way to certify that the log is in fact certified and proper.
Got a question here. Who can use the 100 air mile radius exemption?
So essentially, the 100 air mile radius exemption is an exemption attributed into the United States. So all drivers, both commercial and non-commercial, that operate within a 100 air mile radius of their normal work reporting locations must satisfy certain limitations and record-keeping requirements under Part 395. Specifically, a driver is not required to fill out a log with a graph grid if he or she comes under the 100 air mile radius exception. This exception applies for any day in which a driver is in a certain category, such as drives within 100 air mile radius of their normal reporting location. If the driver's reporting location changes, they cannot use this exception anymore. The driver must also return to their reporting location and also be released within 12 consecutive hours. If the driver does not return or goes beyond 12 consecutive hours, the driver must now comply fully with the log hours of service recording requirements. The driver must also follow all basic hours of service rules, and this includes being off 10 hours in a day and no driving after 11 hours in a day. What gets into a challenging scenario is with motor carriers. Again, being a former auditor, I used to stop and inspect drivers within the radius. The driver would say to me, I'm not required to surrender a log to you because I'm taking advantage of this exception. The condition for this exception to apply is that the motor carrier must keep time records of the times a driver reports for and is released from work each day, and the total on-duty hours each day. A driver does not have to have these records in their truck. So to the scenario I just described, the driver does not have to surrender to the officer. I want to stress the fact that this exception is optional, since a driver and their employer may choose to use a logbook even though they are within the 100-mile radius, so that they do not have to be released within a 12-hour period that day. If you go beyond 12 hours, you still have your log and you're covered. The other very important consideration is that the motor carrier that employs these drivers and takes advantage of these exceptions, they may not be aware of the fact that they must maintain and retain for a period of 6 months accurate and true time records. They must show the following: the time the driver reports for work for duty each day, the total number of hours the driver is on duty each day, the time the driver is released from on duty each day, and the total time for the preceding 7 days, in accordance with the regulation for drivers that are newly hired or are used intermittently. So again, I go to the scenario, I've stopped Joe Trucker at roadside using the 100-mile air radius rule. He doesn't have a log to surrender. I take my inspector hat off, I put my auditor hat on, and I visit the principal place of business, and I ask the motor carrier those 4 questions. If the motor carrier does not have these accurate records, then guess what? the driver now requires a log and must surrender it at roadside. At time of audit, this is where a driver and the motor carrier can both be cited for not complying with that rulemaking.
Got a question here. What about trucks that occasionally go outside of the 100 air mile radius?
All right, well, this is an interesting question. If a driver is not traveling outside their 100 air mile radius for more than 8 days out of any 30 days, they are not required to use an ELD. This is the first thing. This is right out of the exemptions under the rulemaking. So they won't need ELD to track their hours of service for the days they're subject to hours of service. Thus, they can equip their vehicles and use in a manner, typically Big Road has the electronic logs, a paper log, and it basically allows the driver to manually recreate their log with the assistance of the technology. This lets a driver to use the on-duty and off-duty times when under this exemption and track the appropriate duty statuses changes when within the 100-mile radius. So again, I want to stress the fact that even though the driver is within the 100 air mile radius rule, the requirement to comply with the rules remain. There has been no change with that. The difference being now is they're not required to comply with ELD. If a driver drives outside the air mile radius for 9 days or more in any 30-day period, and a 30-day period is a rolling 30 days, so it could be between the 15th of February and the 15th of March. It doesn't have to be an entire month. So that's where things could get a little bit tricky, is when you have drivers in and out of the 100-mile radius rule or going in and out of the 8-day rule. Just because you have technology that you've deployed doesn't mean you have to surrender the records at roadside, but it's a really solid backup should your drivers go outside the radius or go outside the number of days. You've already got it covered with the technology.
So question here, how do you obtain an exemption from the ELD mandate? We are less than 10 miles over the 100 air mile radius limit. Is there any variation on the enforcement side? I currently drive a 2004 International that is not exempt. What are my options with these situations?
Well, motor carriers would have to make a formal request to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for an exemption under ELD. The ELD rulemaking is quite prescribed, so I'm sure you've seen other instances where other sectors of the industry have requested exemptions, being the aggregate industry, agriculture. There's been requests for ready mix. There have been other requests from the motion picture industry. So really, you'd have to get the ball rolling in terms of writing a formal request to FMCSA to get the ball rolling on that.
Another question here. We're an installation and maintenance contractors and all employees drive. Only 3 Class A vehicles though. We typically can take the 100 air mile exception, but not always. Not all employees drive every day, nor will all employees log into ELDs every day. Therefore, when we do need to keep paper logs, how do we deal with the 7-day log requirement? Maybe the timesheet route will work? If you could address this type of vehicle and the ELD use, that would be great.
All right, so that response is not unlike what I mentioned previously. So, to begin with, the driver has to account for 365 days a year. Now, what is different is the requirement to surrender the log at roadside, but in all instances, the motor carrier has to keep accurate records. So I believe that answers your question on that front.
So a question here from Wesley. He asks, how do I handle exempt drivers driving vehicles with ELDs? We have several light trucks that only require CDL drivers that are not exempt from ELDs when pulling large trailers. Most other times, the trucks are used as short haul with drivers that do not have CDLs and are exempt from HOS record keeping.
All right, so under the ELD rulemaking, all drive time has to be accounted for. So when you're dealing with an exempt driver, there's a description under Part 3.1.3 of the rulemaking. Specifically in the case of a non-ELD driver, it could be a mechanic, an office staff, it could be a driver trainer giving a road test. My recommendation to protect your company is to set each one of these individuals with an exempt driver account. Since the non-ELD driver is not required to prepare a record of duty status, they do not have to have a login. However, the ELD is going to capture all of that movement as being unidentified driving, and it's going to put it in the unidentified driver profile. Therefore, in order to protect your fully regulated ELD drivers, you want to set up your exempt driver accounts for these mechanics and other internal staff so that you can reallocate the unidentified driving time properly to these individuals and allow your fully regulated driver to go on their trip, not having to accept or reject this unidentified driving time. Therefore, as I said, each non-ELD driver must be set up with their own account. When they log into that movement, they will go into the non-ELD driver's exempt account. If the exempt account is not created, as I said, all identified driving time goes into this unidentified driver profile. This is where it creates issues if, in fact, your driver starts his day and he sees 400 miles of unidentified driver time. If this is not accounted for, this is potentially a red flag, both at roadside and also in the event that you as a motor carrier are audited, because unidentified driving time has to be accounted for at all times. So you want to be proactive with that. You want to set up these proper exempt drivers so that you can proactively account for this time and not have to explain it at time of audit. If it were me, I would have the drivers fully comply with these requirements, knowing that they don't always have to surrender the documents at roadside when exempt. This safety valve will ensure when they are not exempt, they will have the proper records for the day in question and the previous 7 days to surrender. Otherwise, as you know, Murphy's Law will kick in at some point in time, and this driver will be stopped without having the required documents when not exempt.
Question here from Lillian from BST Auto Transport. Does the AOBRD report on trip meet all IFTA requirements so we can use these monthly reports for each state that includes longitude, latitude?
So both the AOBRD and ELD solutions at Big Road provide distances for each jurisdiction travel. Clients would then have to input the IFTA report based on the distance entries that are reflected on the appropriate solution. Clients would then have to input the fuel reporting separately, as you know. IFTA is a solution that Big Road is currently working on. We want to enhance our IFTA reporting to our fleets to support additional vehicle mileage audit data. So stay tuned for those enhancements.
Question from Jason at Kimball Mechanical. If my employee does not complete their log for the previous day, should I keep them from driving that day?
Absolutely. It's incumbent both the driver and the motor carrier share responsibility for complying with Part 395. So if you have a driver who has not completed his log for the previous day, I would have that driver sit down and update his records accordingly prior to leaving on the day in question. So this also would include the previous 7 days, as that's question number 2 asked by the inspector. Show me your log for today. Show me your log for the previous 7 days if in the US. Show me your logs for the previous 14 days. So you want to protect your CSA scores on the hours of service fatigue basic, and the best way of doing that is holding your drivers accountable. Otherwise, both you and your driver can equally be cited for this.
Question from Gloria at Barlow Trucking. How does the ag exemption work?
There has been a lot of discussion about the agricultural exemption. There's currently a 90-day waiver for the transportation of agricultural commodities. I will ask Alex to send out to whomever's on this call a link to this. There's a Q&A document. It's a sheet that can help you understand clearly the agricultural exemption. There's a number of bullets. So There's an exemption under the hours of service rules during planting and harvesting periods as determined by a specific state. It's for the transportation of many types of agricultural commodities. This includes, but is not limited to, livestock, bees, and other commodities, and it flows within a 150 air mile radius. This same provision applies to the delivery of supplies and equipment for agricultural use from a wholesale or retail distribution point. In addition, the hours of service regulation does not apply to the transportation of agricultural commodities operating completely within the 150 air mile radius for both for-hire and private carriers. Therefore, work and driving hours are not limited and the driver is not required to use ELD. In an operation where drivers share vehicles equipped with ELD, a driver that is always exempt can use this exempt driver account that I've referenced previously. Now, once the driver operates beyond the 150 air mile radius, the hours of service regulation applies. Therefore, the starting at the time and location where the driver goes past the 150 mile radius, the driver must now maintain logs using ELD unless the driver or the vehicle meets another one of the ELD exemptions. The driver must also work and drive within the limits of the hours of service rules when operating beyond this 150 mile rule. Time spent working within the 150 miles will not count towards the driver's daily and weekly limits. Also, when operating within the 150 mile rule, the driver should not log into ELD. Upon exiting this radius, then the driver is required to log in, and then, of course, is required to annotate any of the unassigned miles accumulated to that point when they were exempt. Drivers transporting agricultural commodities are also not required to use ELD if they're operating a commercial motor vehicle model year or 2000 or older. This is provided now, the default being having paper logs. So what typically is going to happen is you'll have inspectors at roadside that are going to note that you're operating agricultural commodities. So they will default to the earlier rules being the paper logs. So again, not exempt, but you don't require ELD. There are other exemptions. The 8 and 30-day period also applies. Finally, there's a covered farm vehicle under Part 395.5 that are exempt from hours of service. And these carriers operating are also not required to have ELD. I want to stress, though, that this only applies to private transportation, so not for hire of agricultural commodities. This includes livestock owned by the owner or the operator of a farm or a ranch or their family members or employees. I want to note that the DOT and Congress are in discussions to add additional agricultural exemptions at the moment because this is very complex and there's a lot of discussion underway with agriculture.
Question here from William at Rushstone Rapid Transport. Occasionally, I need to drive new unladen trucks from a dealership to another dealership or from a body manufacturer to a dealership, etc. What are the logging requirements for this type of transfer when the truck is not fitted with an ELD or it is not the one that I'm assigned to use?
So I get this type of question fairly regularly, and the default response is the first order of business. You have to determine whether or not the vehicle that is being transported is in fact a commercial motor vehicle by definition of the regulations in the United States. So a commercial motor vehicle means a motor vehicle or a combination of motor vehicles that is used in commerce to transport either passengers or property. And there's three categories. Group A is a combination vehicle. This such vehicle has a gross combined weight rating or gross weight of 11,794 kilograms or 26,001 pounds, whichever is greater. This is inclusive of a towed unit if it has a gross weight rating or a gross vehicle weight of more than 10,000 pounds, whatever is greater. So when we talk about gross weight, we're talking about an actual combination vehicle going on a weigh scale and weighing beyond these limits that I've described. The next is a Group B vehicle, and this would be a straight vehicle. This vehicle would not have a trailer, of course, so it's a straight single unit. It has a gross vehicle weight rating. So the weight rating, just for your information, is if you open the driver's side door, you will have a vehicle identification or a VIN plate. If you look at that VIN plate, it's going to have some specific coding on there, and it's going to be GVWR. If you see the GVWR, which represents gross vehicle weight rating, if it exceeds 26,000 or 1 pounds, or if you are escorted to a scale, a weigh station, and you weigh more than 26,001 pounds, you will be deemed to be a commercial motor vehicle. The third category is a Group C vehicle. Now, this is a vehicle that does not meet either Group A or Group B, but is designed to transport 16 or more passengers, including the driver. So if it exceeds that, it is considered a commercial motor vehicle. The next is if your vehicle is of any size, but is used in the transportation of hazardous materials as defined in this section. So if you're hauling hazmat and your hazardous materials are to the extent that the vehicle is placarded on all four sides, then that is also considered a commercial motor vehicle. Now, if these types of vehicles meet the definition, then a motor carrier can use paper logs, electronic logs to capture hours of service, AOBRD compliant devices, or an ELD, depending on the scenarios. There are, of course, additional exceptions to the regs that are afforded different types of operations. I've talked a little bit about some of them. The short haul radius, there are other exceptions. Again, I have a chart that I've created that I'd be my pleasure sharing with you. Finally, now that the ELD rulemaking is in place, the following operators of commercial motor vehicles continue to remain exempt from the ELD rulemaking, but they must complete paper logs because, again, the hours of service rules have not changed. It's just the ELD or the manner in which data is transferred that has changed. So drivers using paper records of duty status no more than 8 days out of 30. Drivers operating drive-away, tow-away operations who transport empty vehicles intended for sale, lease, or repair, as long as the vehicle they are driving is part of the shipment. So essentially, what you're towing is your shipment. These drivers would be exempt under ELD. Finally, drivers of vehicles manufactured before the model year 2000 are also exempt. Again, I do have a chart, and it'd be my pleasure to send it to you. If you send an email off to Big Road and request this chart, it would be my pleasure to send that off to you.
Question here from Lori at Pressed Express. Our company is using AOBRDs. If we hire a driver after December 18th, 2017, does that driver's device have to be set as an ELD?
Yeah, there's been some interesting policy shifts taking place at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Authority, and it's really hot off the press. So there was original rulemaking that said if a motor carrier and a driver is subject to the requirements of ELD, they must begin using ELD or a grandfathered ELD on December 18th, 2017. This is the compliance date for the ELD. If the AOBRD was deployed prior to that date, the driver can use an AOBRD. The most recent policy change, when it came out just this past Friday, and I shared with my team, is the fact that if you have a motor carrier using AOBRD prior to the December 28th date, I want to bring to your attention that this has now been revised to permit carriers that have installed such devices can continue to install new ELD capable devices, but under the AOBRD grandfathering clause up until December 16th, 2019. I say this because previous guidance prohibited the installation and use after December 18th. So there's been a fairly significant shift by the FMCSA. So this is a good news story that I wanted to share right hot off the press.
So question here from Nancy. Can an inspector ask a driver to print their logs? If so, can the driver be fined if their printer doesn't work?
Okay, this is an interesting question. There's differences between AOBRD and ELD. So I'll start with the AOBRD requirements. So under Part 395.15, the following information is required in order for an AOBRD to be compliant. The device shall produce, upon demand, a driver's hours of service chart, an electronic display, or a printout showing the time sequence of the duty status changes, including the driver's start time at the beginning of each day. The key word in that whole paragraph is the word "or." What that means is if the driver has a printer, they can print it out. If they don't, they can surrender the electronic display. But the officer at roadside still has the discretion to ask for paper logs. So again, the significance is that you ensure your driver has an adequate supply of blank logs, because if the inspector cannot understand or interpret the electronic log, they will default back to paper logs. So please make sure your drivers have adequate blank logs for the day in question and the previous 7 days. Now the same thing goes under the ELD provisions. So it's a little known requirement, and something I wanted to point out is the display requirements to an inspector at roadside. So again, we go back to the default being display, transmit, or show logs to the officer. Now, in terms of the display requirements, if you are using technology where the device is tethered to the tractor, so in other words, it cannot be reasonably viewed by the safety official, they will default back to either having paper logs surrendered or emailed. So that's very, very important. The officer will not get into the tractor of the vehicle. So the device, if tethered, had better be long enough with a long enough cable so that it can go outside the truck. So absence of a printout, an ELD must be designed so that its display may be reasonably viewed by the safety officer without entering the vehicle. And again, from Big Road's perspective, we have a completely wireless solution, so that is not an issue at all for Big Road.
Question here from Jason from High Point Audiological. We have only C-class vehicles. Do we still need to install ELDs?
So I haven't had the benefit of corresponding with Jason at High Point, and if you're on the call, Jason, you can send me a point of clarification. But in the absence of an interpretation, I will go back to what is deemed to be a Group C vehicle, and that's something I've described earlier in this webinar. And that specifically is a vehicle that does not meet either Group A or B, is designed for 16 or more passengers, including the driver, or it could be any size of vehicle used in the transportation of hazardous materials. And that, of course, would require full placarding of the vehicle and labeling of the load.
Okay, some questions here. How do we know that your device is compliant?
Well, manufacturers such as Fleet Complete, Big Road, and others are responsible for registering their ELD devices and certifying that they meet the technical specifications as set out in the ELD rulemaking. We at Big Road have gone through extensive work using the technical specifications described in the rulemaking to comply with the provisions. Now, there's going to be other ELD vendors out in the industry. Perhaps you're contracted with one of those. If they do not meet the ELD rulemaking, they will probably be discovered rather quickly, because the output file, the ELD output file, prescribes exactly what the ELD log must look like, and it's quite different from AOBRD. There's, I could spend the next 2 hours talking about the ELD rulemaking specifically, but it has to synchronize automatically. There's other provisions in there that must be met. So we at Big Road have a fully compliant device.
Question here, how do I properly use personal conveyance?
Personal conveyance, just so you know, is an area that is under consideration by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Authority. And also, the conveyance rules are different. For those of you that are Canadian listeners, the rules are more prescriptive in Canada than in the United States. Specifically in Canada, there's a 75-kilometer limit, whereas in the United States, there isn't. Personal conveyance in the United States, and really in Canada for that matter, the driver has to be completely relieved of responsibility and free to pursue activities of their own volition, and is used typically, you've ended your work day, you want to get to a place of safety, you want to park for the night, you want to go to a restaurant, grab a bite to eat. The rules in the United States at this current time speak to the vehicles being unladen. Just so you know, there is consideration that they're going to move on that requirement to allow partially or even fully laden vehicles to be moved. But I want to caution you that that's not been provided as guidance at this point in time, but it's something FMCSA is looking at. So, really the time spent traveling short distances, en route lodging, terminals, motels, restaurants can be considered as personal conveyance. Now, I want to stress the fact that you got to use common sense. Again, being a former DOT inspector, if a driver has an hours of service log taking him from point A to point B, which is 600 miles away, and he's got 500 miles of personal conveyance, that's likely not going to fly. So the driver should annotate, protect themselves, annotate in the remarks section what the personal conveyance was and that they were relieved of responsibility. But if the DOT can connect the dots to show that your driver is doing something, active for the purpose of commerce, that personal conveyance rule will not be applicable.
Question here, how do I properly use yard move?
Okay, yard move is a category that is available on the Big Road solution, and is really designed for a driver operating a commercial motor vehicle on a surface that's not deemed to be a public highway. So at your terminal, if they're shunting trailers, if they're moving a tractor from one point to another point, if they're moving a trailer in a different location, if they're conducting moves on a customer site where they're not on a public highway, even though the driver is technically driving the vehicle, the driver should indicate on duty, not driving, on his record of duty status. The driver must do so while performing duties on behalf of the motor carrier. So another important point is, your driver gets to a maximum limit either in Canada or the United States. The driver can keep on doing work. He can keep on driving a vehicle, but as long as it's not on a public highway, he will not be cited under the hours of service rules. It's only in those instances where the DOT can put the driver on a public highway exceeding these hours. So the other thing though, of course, the time the driver spends operating on these types of driving time does affect the driver's maximum on-duty time and will also impact the amount of time of rest they have to take before they start driving again. So I want to caution you of that. Therefore, if there's at any point in time the driver resumes driving on a public highway, all the on-duty not driving time accumulated on these non-public highways count towards the maximum times.
Question here, are elogs compliant with the ELD mandate?
So elogs, just so you know, is just another way to speak to a paper log in an electronic format. It doesn't have any automatic synchronization. It's not connected via Bluetooth with any hardware that reads data from the ECM. It's essentially just a tool to provide for an electronic log. So my answer is the elog, unless it complies with all of the functional requirements, it would not deem to be compliant. So this means you'd have to either have a dash link from Big Road or an MGS 700 device from Fleet Complete that is installed in the vehicle and connected to the Big Road mobile application to be compliant. Using the application alone without connecting to the dash link or MGS is not ELD compliant according to the rulemaking.
Question here, do I need to have an ELD if I only drive in Canada?
So the ELD requirements are specific to the United States. Now, I sit as part of the Federal Task Force Committee with Transport Canada and the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators, or the CCMTA. As you've likely heard, Canada is in the midst of, they already have the rulemaking in place, but at this point in time, ELD would be purely voluntary in Canada at this time. As Transport Canada and the CCMTA makes any formal announcements regarding ELD, I, as a rule, will post that feedback. And there's actually a blog that we've just finished here at Big Road that's going to be posted, which explains the ELD rulemaking and what the differences are. As you know, Canada and the US have different rules, and we've put together a really nice blog that will explain the differences for your benefit.
Question here, what is the minimum speed that a truck needs to be going in order for an ELD to switch into driving status according to the FMCSA?
According to the ELD rulemaking, there's a section called the Vehicle Motion Status section, and that falls under Part 4.3.12. What it says is that the ELD must automatically determine whether a vehicle is in motion or stopped by comparing the vehicle speed information with respect to a set speed threshold in the following method. Once the vehicle speed exceeds the speed threshold, it is considered in motion. Once in motion, the vehicle must be considered in motion until it falls to 0 miles per hour and stays at 0 for 3 consecutive seconds. At that point in time, the vehicle is considered stopped. The ELD will set the speed threshold for determining the in-motion state for the purposes of this section, and it will be configurable to be greater than 5 miles an hour. So if a vehicle goes beyond 5 miles an hour, the ECM will then put the driver automatically in drive status from on duty not driving. If the ELD is required to have a link to the vehicle's ECM, the vehicle speed information will be acquired through the ECM. Otherwise, the vehicle speed information will be acquired using an independent source apart from the positioning services such as a GPS, and it must be accurate within plus minus 3 miles per hour of the true ground speed for the purposes of determining the in-motion state. Finally, FMCSA has established this requirement to determine the initiation of vehicle motion at a speed of no greater than 5 miles per hour.
Question here. Why do other ELDs switch to driving status at 15 or 20 miles per hour, but Big Road switches at 5?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, if you are equipped with a ELD device that switches the driving status at 15 or 20 miles per hour, you know right there and then that the ELD vendor you are using is not complying with the rulemaking. The rulemaking prescribes 5 miles per hour as being the threshold. An ELD that allows the vehicle to move at speeds of 15 and 20 miles per hour would be technically non-compliant with the rulemaking and could be removed as a certified device.
So what do I need to keep in my vehicle when running ELDs?
This is a real important question, and something we really want to help you with. I'm really proud of the work done by Big Road on this front. After the December 18th rulemaking, the driver using an ELD must have an ELD information packet on board the commercial motor vehicle. It must contain a number of items: a user's manual for the driver describing how to operate the ELD, an instructions sheet describing the data transfer mechanisms supported by ELD, a step-by-step instruction to produce and transfer the driver's hours of service to the official at roadside, as well an instruction sheet for the driver describing any ELD malfunction reporting requirements, as well as the record-keeping procedures under ELD when malfunctioning. Finally, the driver again needs to have a sufficient supply of graph grids to recreate the logs in a paper manner. So I just want to note that Big Road has all of these tools at your disposal, and they are readily available on our website and is also included as a packet when you sign up with Big Road.
Okay, so we do have a chance here for you guys to ask any other questions that you have. So if you do have questions or if you'd like clarification on something, you can just type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. So I'll give you just a minute here to type in any questions that you might have. All right, so we've got a question here. Can you use personal conveyance when you have an empty trailer, so like an OO-owned trailer?
I'm assuming, again, we're talking in the United States. The answer to that question is yes. Under current state, the personal conveyance rules allow you to use this duty status to book yourself off duty when you are unladen. As I mentioned previously, FMCSA is in the midst of amending that rulemaking, but they haven't proclaimed anything as of yet, so stay tuned for that. As soon as there is direction provided, I will be posting that information on our Big Road site for your benefit.
All right, question here from Ashley. Can the compliance officer edit logs from the Fleet Complete dashboard, or are they required to be done on a tablet in Tractor by the driver?
So that would be dependent on the type of technology being used. If the driver is operating under AOBRD, then yes, the compliance officer can edit the logs on behalf of the driver. Under the ELD rulemaking, as part of the anti-harassment provisions in the new world, the safety officer can suggest edits but it has to be certified either by being accepted or being rejected by the driver, and the driver would then sign off on the acceptance, or the rejection would be noted on the record of duty status.
All right, we have a question here from George. If we have unassigned driving, is the driver the only one who can correct this, or can we do it with the dashboard? And what is the rule?
So in terms of unassigned driving, it depends if the unassigned driving is appropriate to the driver in question. So if the unassigned driving does belong to that driver, then certainly that driver can correct this. If not, then the back office safety official would have to determine who in fact this unassigned driving belongs to, and under the ELD rulemaking will then request that that unassigned drive time be accepted by the appropriate driver, who then in turn will either accept or reject that time.
All right, question here from Tina. What should you do if the dash link quits connecting during a trip, so it malfunctions?
All right, that's a great question. And if you're on the on the Big Road site, you'll see I wrote a blog specifically on that point. And it goes back to what I said earlier on in the webinar. A driver at all times should have blank logs at their disposal. So if the dash link quits working, the driver can default back to paper logs and is required to annotate in the remarks section that the device has failed and that the driver is reverting back to paper logs, and that is to be surrendered to any officer at roadside.
Question here from Julie. Carriers who are running AOBRDs can now run all net new vehicles as AOBRDs as per the most recent update. Is this correct?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this is correct. If you look at the, again, I'm going to have this posted on our Big Road site if it hasn't already been done so. It was hot off the press this past Friday. There was a significant policy shift adopted by FMCSA, and again, effective March 9th, so you know how quickly that is. Essentially, the revised guidance now permits motor carriers that had installed and required their drivers to use AOBRDs prior to the December 18th, 27 date may now continue to use and install new ELD capable devices, but the difference is they can run it under AOBRD software until December 16, 2019. As you likely know, and it's too bad they didn't make this switch earlier, but the previous guidance had prohibited this. So essentially, if you weren't AOBRD compliant prior to December 18th, then you had to fall under the ELD rulemaking. So this is definitely a shift that provides much more flexibility. But the caveat, the key importance is that you would have had to be AOBRD deployed according to the grandfathering provisions under the ELD rulemaking in order to meet this new policy direction provided by FMCSA.
Got a question here from Shirley asking, where do I find the driver malfunction instructions? So Shirley, if you actually go onto the Big Road website, there's a tab along the top that says resources. You can click on that tab, click ELD resources, and we've posted online our driver and malfunction card. And you can either request a hard copy of this so you can have it printed in your vehicle, or you can download it and save it to your mobile device so that you have a copy if you ever need to access it on your mobile device. Okay, I think we're going to answer one more question here. And it's from Shirley. How many days will an officer accept notes that there are malfunctions with the AOBRD?
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Thank you for your question, Shirley. Again, if you go on the Fleet Complete website, you'll see I wrote a blog on that. There's different responsibilities for different entities. So for the driver, if there's an AOBRD malfunction, first of all, and this is something I've seen some drivers be cited for, if they are not adequately trained regarding the proper operations, and this is under AOBRD, I'll talk about ELD thereafter, they can be cited. The driver has to note any failure of the AOBRD. They have to reconstruct the duty status for the past 7 days. The driver has to continue to prepare a handwritten record of all subsequent duty statuses until the AOBRD is operational. Now, from the motor carrier's perspective, they must ensure that the driver has a supply of blank logs. They have to ensure the driver has a certificate from the AOBRD manufacturer certifying that the design meets the requirements. The AOBRD has to be tamper-proof. It has to be maintained and calibrated. You have to ensure that, again, the driver is adequately trained. So essentially, the driver has to keep on operating with the paper logs and noting the malfunctions. The driver must also note the malfunction, and now we're talking ELD, provide written notice to the carrier within 24 hours. They have to continue to reconstruct the logs as well, go back 7 consecutive days. They have to continue to manually prepare logs until the ELD is serviced. The motor carrier, you have to correct, repair, or replace, reservice the malfunctioning ELD within 8 days of discovering the condition or from the driver's notification, whichever comes first. You have to require that the driver continues to maintain the records until the ELD is back in service. So really we're talking about an 8-day period. And then of course the ELD vendor, we have to attempt to correct the malfunction. If the FMCSA petitions us to remove it from their certification process, there's a whole written process. There's a 30-day response period the ELD vendor is provided to correct. And then ultimately, you know, going beyond 60 days, FMCSA will make a determination if the ELD no longer complies. And then 30 days thereafter, the ELD will be removed from the FMCSA's list of certified ELDs.
All right, so we are out of time here. A few more things to note. If you did have a question that we weren't able to get to, please feel free to send us an email with your question at marketing@bigroad.com. Just mention that you were attending the webinar, we didn't get to your question, and then type out what your question is, and we'll be happy to send that over to Mark to have it answered. Also, just to remind you, I will be sending out a recording of this webinar tomorrow. So that means that you can watch it again or share it with other people on your team. But thank you guys so much for attending and have a great day.
Thank you so much.